What if your own family left you to freeze alone in the dark? Eleanor was moments away from giving up on life until a midnight sermon from the Pope changed everything. She had lost everyone she loved. But can a single act of kindness reignite a heart turned cold by betrayal? Welcome to her Fireside Stories, wishing you a wonderful listening experience. Snow fell in feathery clumps, settling into the nooks and crannies of the quiet little town and cloaking everything in a soft, cold hush. Streets lay deserted beneath a layer of fresh white, and the evergreen trees bent under the weight of winter's offering. In an old, dimly lit house by the end of a lonesome lane, an elderly woman named Eleanor sat by the window in silence. Outside, gentle flakes drifted from an overcast sky, but inside the air was still as though time itself had forgotten to turn its wheel. The wallpaper in her living room had faded to a pale peeling pattern of roses, and the once warm furniture seemed draped in shadows rather than upholstery. The only sound was a rhythmic tick-tock of a grandfather clock whose chimes had grown hoarse with age. Eleanor gazed out through the frosted glass, her eyes distant and empty, capturing neither the dance of the snowfall nor the occasional flicker of street lights. She barely registered the cold. Her mind traveled a different path, one that looped through memories of heartbreak. Scattered photo frames on the mantel held glimpses of yesteryear, testifying to a life once filled with loved ones. Yet all those smiles felt like illusions in the present gloom. The ache in her chest was constant, an old companion she had grown to accept. She could recall a time when her heart felt warm and full, when love came as easily as breathing, and the future felt like a story brimming with possibilities. But as the years went by and the betrayals accumulated, she found herself retreating from the world, letting solitude wrap around her like a second winter coat. There was no daily bustle to fill her hours, no eager laughter to fill her home. What remained was an echo of something that once was lingering in the corners of her mind. Looking at her reflection in the glass, Eleanor saw eyes that had once sparkled with life, now dulled by sorrow. Her breath fogged against the window, momentarily obscuring her own image. Then as she leaned back, a faint whisper escaped her lips as though spoken more to the walls than to herself. It was a sentiment she had come to accept as truth. She recalled an old line she once read. Some hearts once burned brightly, but after too much loss, all that's left are ashes. Eleanor once believed her life would end quietly just like that. It was a sentiment that felt painfully accurate. There was no defiance left in her, or so she thought. She settled her head against the armchair, feeling the steady ache in her bones, as if every sorrow she'd ever experienced lay stored in her joints. Outside snow continued to fall with unhurried grace, as if the sky was weeping in gentle, icy tears. And in that lonely, dimly lit house, Eleanor remained at the window, her story not yet finished, but she had no idea how it could possibly move forward from here. Years before she found herself in this quiet purgatory, Eleanor had been a wife, a mother, a friend. She grew up in a smaller village on the outskirts of the same region where farmland stretched to the horizon, and the sky seemed endlessly blue in summer. Life had its hardships, but there was always a sense of community and support. When she met her husband, Robert, she believed in fairy tales. Though her hands were often calloused from farm chores, her dreams were big enough to encompass bright futures and wide horizons. They married under the old willow tree by the river, where the entire town gathered to celebrate their union. With a bit of luck and a good harvest, they managed a simple but honest life. Their home was once filled with the chatter of children, two daughters and a son, who brought with them the chaos and joys that define motherhood. She remembered early mornings waking up to feed them, pack their lunches, and see them off to school. Evenings were spent with bedtime stories and lullabies, all culminating in a tired but fulfilling sense of purpose. While Robert worked long hours, so did Eleanor, but she never felt alone because at the day's end, the family would gather for dinner share stories and laugh over small victories. That time, however, was fleeting. As the children grew older, life began to shift. The bills piled up and tension in the marriage grew. Eleanor wasn't sure when it truly began. Maybe it was a stray phone call, a late night meeting that didn't feel quite right. Robert came home smelling of expensive perfume, or with a strange look in his eyes that made her stomach churn. Eventually, the betrayal was too large to ignore. He left with another woman and the home they built together, split apart in a haze of recriminations and heartbreak. The children, caught in the middle of the storm, eventually grew up and ventured into their own paths. Careers, relationships, new cities. They called or visited infrequently, every conversation tinged with awkwardness, as though they felt guilty but didn't know what to say or how to fix the silent chasms that had opened. The result was a slow drift that left Eleanor feeling more alone than she ever imagined possible. Over the years, she watched neighbors pack up and move, friends age and pass on, and even the small joys of community gatherings faded away. Her once busy life, filled with errands, chores, and laughter, dwindled into an unchanging pattern, waking, looking out the window, and sleeping. Each day felt heavier than the last. The worst was knowing that Robert never looked back, not even once, and that her children, though they still loved her, were too absorbed in their own struggles to truly be there. The silence that settled over her home was as chilling as any winter wind, a stark contrast to the vibrant warmth she once knew. By the time winter came again in that quiet town, Eleanor had shrunk into a life governed by routine. She woke at dawn more from old habit than need and shuffled around her cold house. Her once favorite knitted shawl, created by her own hands many decades ago, remained draped across her shoulders day and night. It provided only a faint reminder of comfort. The rooms were too big for one person. The echoes of footsteps down hallways, once filled with children's laughter, seemed to haunt every corner. Loneliness is a peculiar thing. It starts as a faint shadow following you around, and then grows into a full silhouette that towers over every thought and every moment. For Eleanor, the nights were the hardest. The ticking clock sounded like a judge passing sentence with every second. She would lie in bed, eyes open in the dark, imagining how at one time the hush of night carried the soft breathing of loved ones. Now all she had was the howling wind outside and her own heartache. She didn't blame anyone anymore. Blame had ceased to give her any comfort or catharsis. Instead, a numbing acceptance took its place. Neighbors had all but vanished. The last family that lived next door had moved to a larger city for better opportunities. The postman came once a day. Sometimes not at all if there was no mail to deliver. Groceries were sparse in her kitchen. She ate lightly, just enough soup or a piece of bread to keep her going. The sparkle in her eyes had long since dimmed. It felt like her life was one continuous winter. Each gust of wind a reminder of a world that had moved on without her. Yet in these silent, snowy days, there were moments, brief flashes, where she remembered who she used to be. A mother who once read bedtime stories by lamplight, a wife who once danced under fairy lights with the man she loved, a neighbor who used to bring homemade pies to community gatherings. Those memories tugged at her, urging her to do something other than sit and let her spirit freeze over. But each time she mustered a spark of energy, the question of why stopped her cold. Why do anything? Who would notice? Who would care? This cycle of thought circled endlessly in her mind, pushing her deeper into a pit of gloom. Life as she saw it had become a long stretch of meaningless days that blurred together. If she disappeared tomorrow, she told herself the world might not even blink. She tried to stifle that thought, but it always returned like a relentless echo. In those lonely hours, she found it increasingly difficult to envision a reason to continue. The nights bled into days and days into nights until she reached a point where she hardly kept track of which day of the week it was anymore. It was during one of the harshest nights that her despair reached a tipping point. The storm had rolled in fiercely, piling snow against the doors and windows, and the entire town seemed locked in a frozen trance. Eleanor's heater struggled to fend off the encroaching cold. She huddled under blankets, each breath catching in her chest, forming small clouds of mist in the dim light of a single table lamp. There was a sense of finality in the air, as if the universe itself was suggesting that time had run its course. In that near silence, she could hear the faint whistling of the wind through a gap in the window frame. The noise felt like a lament echoing her own sense of isolation. Her fingers trembled partly from the cold, partly from the emptiness she felt inside. There was a moment, a flicker of a thought where she considered that she might not see the morning. Perhaps she would succumb to the freezing temperatures in her sleep, leaving behind nothing but a memory in a house that nobody visited. She closed her eyes, pulling her blankets tighter, trying to muffle the storm outside. At the same time, the storm inside her own mind was deafening. Desperation gnawed at her, telling her that no one needed her, that she had served her purpose long ago and was now just an afterthought in the grand narrative of life. She could almost see Robert's face, smug and distant, as if she were replaying old arguments in her head. She saw her children as children again, clutching at her apron, begging for one more bedtime story, one more goodnight kiss. How did it all unravel so thoroughly? At some point in the dead of that night, when sleep refused to come, she rose from her bed and made her way to the living room. She fumbled around for the TV remote, thinking that if she could just hear another voice, any voice, it might stave off the overwhelming loneliness. The local channels flickered weakly, some lost to static. She pressed the remote buttons repeatedly, feeling an urgency she hadn't felt in a long time. The need to connect, even if indirectly, to something beyond her own thoughts. Finally, she landed on a live broadcast that cut through the static. The image was faint at first, but then came into focus as the camera panned across a grand hall. It was a religious service of some kind, with rows of people listening intently. At the center was the Pope, wearing his ornate vestments, speaking solemnly into the microphone. Eleanor would never have guessed that she would find herself drawn to a sermon in the middle of the night, but the depth in his voice, the compassion etched in his elderly features, pulled her in. She watched in silence, her own breathing suddenly matched with the hush of the congregation on screen. Eleanor felt an odd sensation stirring inside her as the Pope's words cascaded through the television's tinny speakers. His voice was gentle, yet resolute, an anchor in the howling void of her thoughts. She leaned in closer, hardly blinking, as if by doing so, she could fully absorb every syllable. He spoke of hope, of faith in mankind's innate capacity for goodness, and the importance of not succumbing to the darkness. His gaze swept across the camera, pausing as if to make eye contact with every individual viewer, including a lonely old woman huddled in blankets in a small, silent town. Then, in a calm yet piercing tone, the Pope uttered the words that would change her life forever. Do not let pain steal your ability to love. Do not let the darkness make you forget that you were once a light for someone else. It was as if a crack appeared in the fortress of ice she'd built around her heart. Tears welled in her eyes, surprising her. She couldn't recall the last time she had cried. The tears were hot, tracing lines down her cheeks, and she did nothing to wipe them away. She wanted to feel them, to acknowledge that she was still alive enough to shed them. It was a strange awakening, like seeing the sun after a long, unforgiving winter. The broadcast continued, but her mind fixated on those words. Do not let the darkness make you forget. You were once a light for someone else. She thought about her children, about how she was their source of warmth and guidance when they were little. She thought about neighbors she had once comforted, friends she had once stayed up late with, talking about life's joys and sorrows. In her isolation, she had allowed herself to forget every good thing she had ever done, every act of love she had ever offered to the world. That love was real. It had existed, and if it existed once, maybe it could again. She kept watching, hardly aware of the passing minutes. The sense of despair that had loomed over her was not entirely gone, but it felt as if a window had been cracked open in her soul, letting in the faintest breath of fresh air. The Pope concluded his sermon with a benediction, and the congregation's soft amen echoed in the silence of Eleanor's living room. As the broadcast ended, the screen went to a different program, but she just sat there letting the tears come freely. She was cold. She was old. She was alone. But now something else stirred within her, something she thought long dead hope. That night, for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Eleanor found herself unable to sleep for reasons other than sadness. Her mind churned with the Pope's words, replaying them over and over. Each repetition felt like a gentle knock on the door of her heart, reminding her that she still had the power to make a difference. She wrestled with the notion, part of her wanting to dismiss it. I'm too old. No one cares. It's too late. And another part clinging to the possibility that maybe, just maybe, there was still time. Morning arrived with a pale glow filtering through the snow-covered windows. Instead of retreating back under the covers, Eleanor forced herself out of bed. She realized she had barely eaten the day before, so she headed to the small kitchen. There she remembered a recipe for sugar cookies she used to bake for her children on special occasions. She found the tattered recipe card. The ink nearly faded and decided to give it a try. Her hands shook as she sifted flour and measured out sugar, but they steadied with each step, guided by the muscle memory of 1,000 bakings from her younger days. While the cookies were in the oven, she put a kettle on the stove for tea. The sweet, buttery aroma soon filled her cramped kitchen, and for the first time in a long while, the house smelled like home. Her heart fluttered with a sense of purpose she had all but forgotten. As she arranged the cookies on a plate, she looked outside and noticed a homeless man rummaging through the trash bins across the street. The day was still brutally cold, the sky gray and unforgiving. Impulsively, she grabbed a marker and an old piece of cardboard and wrote, "If you're cold, please take a cookie." She placed the plate on a small table near her front door, propping up the sign so any passerby could see. It was a small gesture, practically insignificant in the grand scheme of things. But to Eleanor, it felt monumental. She watched from behind the curtains as the homeless man approached cautiously, drawn by the warmth of the cookies and perhaps by the simple kindness of the sign. He picked one up, took a bite, and for a moment Eleanor thought she saw a faint smile cross his lips. Her own eyes filled with tears again, but this time they were tears of a different kind, tears of gratitude, of empathy, of remembering what it meant to care. The morning sun broke through the clouds just then, illuminating the snow and making it sparkle. Eleanor felt a weight lift from her heart, as if a door that had been sealed shut was now creaking open. She wasn't sure where this newfound courage would lead her, but she knew that the act of giving, no matter how small, was enough to fan the spark that had been ignited by that sermon. Emboldened by this small success, Eleanor spent the following days looking for other ways to bring light into her cold, quiet world. She ventured out to the local community center, an aging building that served as a daycare for orphaned and foster children, as well as a recreation space for seniors. It had been years since she last walked through those doors. The tile floors and fluorescent lights felt as familiar as they were alien memories of old bake sales, and charity drives flooded her mind. She introduced herself hesitantly to the staff, unsure if anyone would remember her. Yet the moment she mentioned wanting to read stories to the children, they welcomed her with open arms. She began visiting a few times a week armed with picture books she had once read to her own kids. The children's eyes lit up whenever she opened the covers and showed them whimsical illustrations of enchanted forests, talking animals, and brave adventurers. Their giggles and questions filled the air, dispelling the gloom that had so long clung to Eleanor's spirit. Every session felt like a celebration of imagination and innocence, and it reminded her that life could be magical, even in the harshest of winters. After reading, she would sit and chat with other seniors, some of whom she recognized from years ago. They too had stories of families grown distant of houses, now empty of life's unexpected turns. They talked about hardships and loneliness, but also about cherished memories and the small joys that still punctuated their days. The sense of community was tentative, yet real. Eleanor felt her heart thawing bit by bit. One particularly cold afternoon, she met an elderly man wandering the streets in confusion. He had dementia and he couldn't recall his own address. Instead of walking away, Eleanor took his hand, gently guided him into a nearby cafe, and stayed with him until she could contact someone from the community center who knew his family that day, as she helped him find his way home. It struck her how simple acts of care could make the difference between hopelessness and salvation. The more she extended herself, the more she realized that love was a currency that appreciated in value, the more freely it was shared. The warmth she offered to others came back to her in the form of smiles, gratitude, and renewed connections. Her world was no longer limited to the view from her window. She was stepping back into the tapestry of human life, thread by thread, finding that her presence did matter, at least to those she touched. Author's note: thank you for reading along so far. If you're enjoying Eleanor's journey, consider sharing your thoughts or leaving a comment. Your feedback helps shape these stories, and I'd love to know what resonates with you. As the weeks wore on, Eleanor's small gestures began to weave a subtle yet noticeable transformation around her. The once silent street in front of her home became a spot where people paused. Some came for the free cookies or a cup of tea, but others came simply to say hello, curious about the woman who had decided to share warmth with strangers. It wasn't just about the food and drink. It was about the genuine compassion that she poured into every act. She found herself eagerly waiting for the knock on the door or the shuffle of boots in the snow. Every day brought a new story, a new person to connect with. Her own spirit felt lighter, and so did the atmosphere within the old house. The living room, once a place of stagnant memories, now held new ones. Children's laughter echoing from the times she hosted short story sessions, neighbors dropping by with fresh produce as a token of thanks, and even the homeless man who occasionally stopped for a moment of warmth. She learned his name was Jacob. A simple conversation over cookies and tea bridged the gap that had once felt infinite. Word of her kindness trickled through the community. Some praised her for her generosity. Others were simply amazed that someone her age and in her circumstances could demonstrate such boundless empathy. A local reporter tried to interview her for a short piece in the town's newsletter, but Eleanor politely declined. She didn't need her name in print. She didn't need to be labeled a saint. It was enough to know that she could still be of use, that she wasn't merely a faded relic of a past life. For her part, Eleanor found herself spending her nights differently too. She'd sit by the fireplace now, often lit and crackling, thanking the new friends who had helped her gather enough wood to keep the house warm. She wrote down her memories as though reclaiming her own narrative, after years of feeling like a side character in someone else's story. Sometimes she even managed a small smile when she thought back to the Pope's sermon that night. She wondered if he had any idea how many souls he had touched, how many hearts he had nudged back into the realm of hope. Probably thousands, if not millions, just like hers. She also began to reflect more on her children. They were scattered across the country, living hectic lives with jobs and responsibilities. The old bitterness that once colored her thoughts about them began to fade. She saw that they too were navigating a world filled with challenges. She stopped blaming them for not being there as often as she wished. Instead, she quietly forgave them and even considered calling them more frequently, just to let them know she was okay. The fear of rejection still lingered, but the sting had dulled. She was learning that love could exist even if it wasn't always reciprocated in the ways one hoped. As autumn gave way to winter once more, the town council announced a plan for a winter festival, a celebration of community spirit designed to bring neighbors together and to support local charities. Posters appeared in shop windows depicting snowmen, ice sculptures, and the promise of hot cocoa stands. There would be craft booths, music performances, and even a small parade. For many, it was just another seasonal event, but for Eleanor, it became an opportunity to contribute in a bigger way. Recalling how cookies had been her first small gesture, she decided to bake a large batch of them to give away at the festival. She spent days carefully preparing and packaging the treats, scribbling short notes of encouragement to slip into each bag. You matter. Stay warm in body and heart, or simply, thank you for being here. She felt a nervous excitement she hadn't experienced since her children were small, and she used to help organize their school events. Despite her brittle joints protesting every time she stood too long over the kitchen counter, her spirit soared with the anticipation of doing something meaningful. A volunteer from the community center, a young woman named Lila, helped her transport everything to the main square on the morning of the festival. The air was crisp, each breath sending plumes of vapor into the sky, but the crowd buzzed with cheer and laughter. Booths sprang up on every corner of the square offering knitted scarves, homemade jams, and holiday decorations. Children squealed in delight, chasing each other around snow sculptures. The atmosphere was a far cry from the solitude Eleanor had known only a year before. She was given a small spot near a makeshift stage where local bands and choirs would perform. She set up her table with the cookies, a thermos of hot tea, and the encouraging notes. People approached smiling curiously, and she offered them a bag. At first, some were hesitant. Maybe they assumed she was trying to sell something, but when she explained it was all free, that she simply wanted to share a bit of warmth, their faces lit up with gratitude. Parents took cookies for their children. Teenagers giggled over the notes of encouragement, and elders patted her hand in thanks. Before long, it wasn't just the cookies drawing attention. People recognized her from the stories they'd heard the old lady offering tea and cookies at her doorstep, the volunteer reading stories to orphaned children, the quiet presence who helped an elderly man with dementia. They called her Mother Eleanor, a nickname that spread quickly throughout the festival grounds. Though it took her a while to accept it, with each kind word and grateful smile, she felt the last vestiges of her old despair melt away, replaced by something far more enduring, a sense of belonging. As the festival reached its midday peak, more and more people congregated around Eleanor's little station. Some lingered to chat, sharing their own stories of hardship or thanking her for the small gestures she'd shown in passing. Others came simply to stand in a circle of warmth, drawn by an inexplicable sense that here in this unassuming corner of the festival, they could find a moment of solace. Even teenagers, usually too cool to engage in mushy stuff, would pause to read the notes she'd tucked in with the cookies, some discreetly pocketing them as if those words were small anchors of hope. Meanwhile, the town's mayor made his rounds, stopping at each booth to show support. When he reached Eleanor, he paused, eyes wide in pleasant surprise. He recognized her from the neighborhood and had heard rumors about the old lady who gave out cookies in the cold. After tasting one of her freshly baked treats, he smiled broadly and said, "This is exactly the kind of community spirit we hope to celebrate today." The compliment sent a warm rush through her, a validation that her simple acts did indeed matter. Around mid-afternoon, the local choir took the stage, and their songs wafted over the crowd like a gentle lullaby. The melody brought tears to Eleanor's eyes, although this time they were tears of joy. She reflected on how vastly different this winter was from the previous one. Last year, she had nearly given up. Now she found herself enveloped in the laughter and camaraderie of people who saw her not as a burden or a forgotten relic, but as a vital thread in the tapestry of the town. Yet the greatest surprise came later in the day when a group of volunteers unveiled a handmade sign that read, Mother Eleanor's Corner, where cold hearts find warmth. They placed it right next to her booth. Eleanor's heart soared at the sight of it. She actually gasped, placing a hand over her mouth, overcome by gratitude. She wasn't searching for fame or recognition. She merely wanted to share kindness, but seeing that sign made with bright colors and careful lettering stirred a deep sense of fulfillment she hadn't felt in years. It was as if she was receiving a hug from the entire town. The children who had heard her read stories clamored around her, tugging at her coat and asking if she would read a tale or two before the day was over. She obliged with a smile, gathering them into a tight circle as she opened a well-worn storybook about a brave polar bear who overcame many trials. Their giggles and wide-eyed wonder felt like the most authentic applause she could ever receive. The day wore on, and the sun began to set, painting the sky with ribbons of pink and orange. Lanterns and fairy lights popped on across the festival grounds, casting a warm, golden glow. Music played on, and the air was thick with the scents of spiced cider and roasted chestnuts. Eleanor found a moment to rest, sitting on a small stool behind her table. She sipped a cup of tea that one of the volunteers brought her, reflecting on the extraordinary shift in her life. A year ago, she could never have imagined standing at the heart of a community event offering cookies and receiving smiles in return. She would never have believed that a simple sermon on TV could awaken her from a deep slumber of despair. And yet here she was, her eyes shining with the happiness of someone who had rediscovered their purpose. Toward the end of the night, some of the older townspeople approached her. They expressed thanks not just for the cookies, but also for the renewed sense of unity her actions had inspired. It's like a ripple, said one older woman. You tossed a pebble of kindness into the water, and now we're all feeling the waves. It was a poetic way of describing the power of small acts, and Eleanor held on to those words, letting them resonate in her heart. When the festival finally began to wind down, children tired and cranky were coaxed home by patient parents. Booths started to close and the music began to fade. Eleanor gathered her remaining cookies and the sign that bore her new nickname. She offered the extra cookies to the volunteers who were dismantling the stalls, receiving grateful nods in return. Lila helped her pack up and offered her a ride home, which she accepted gladly. As Lila's car pulled away from the festival grounds, Eleanor watched the bright lights grow smaller and smaller in the rearview mirror. She felt a familiar pang, something akin to sadness that the day was ending, but it was a wistful sadness, the kind that follows a moment of beauty rather than a feeling of emptiness. She realized that while the festival was over, the connections she had made, the warmth she had shared, were not so fleeting. They would endure, perhaps even grow stronger in the days to come. Arriving at her driveway, Eleanor stepped out into the cold night, her breath visible as tiny clouds. The porch light cast a soft halo around her front door. As she turned the key, she felt the old weariness tug at her bones, but it was tempered by a renewed sense of belonging. Tomorrow was another day, and she already had plans to visit the community center. The idea that each new day held promise warmed her more than any heater ever could. Life settled into a gentle rhythm after the winter festival. The snow continued to blanket the little town, but it no longer felt like a suffocating weight on Eleanor's spirit. She awoke each morning with a small thrill, wondering who she might meet and how she might help. At the community center, she expanded her storytelling sessions to include crafts, paper snowflakes, simple drawings and little collages that the children adored making. She found herself laughing along with them, their joy contagious, and for the first time in ages, she felt her age more as a testament to wisdom than a barrier to living fully. In her neighborhood, people had become accustomed to seeing her rummaging through her cupboards for donations or heading outside with trays of tea. She was no longer that mysterious, lonely figure peeking from behind lace curtains. Instead, she had become something of an icon, a symbol of what kindness and perseverance could look like. Occasionally, new faces knocked on her door just to say hello, some drawn by curiosity, and others by a genuine desire to thank her. Each interaction left her more convinced that her life still held purpose. Eleanor also began making phone calls to her children. The first few calls were awkward, stumbling affairs. She wasn't sure how to begin, and they too seemed uncertain what to say to a mother they had unintentionally neglected for so long. But each call ended on a more hopeful note than the last. Her older daughter promised to visit in the spring. Her son mentioned he might be able to take time off for a quick weekend trip. Her youngest daughter, the free spirit of the family, gushed with excitement at hearing her mother's changed outlook. Though the details remained fuzzy, the promise of reconnection shimmered in the near distance. Word of her transformation even reached Robert's ears, or so she was told. He had remarried years ago, and though their parting was fraught with bitterness, Eleanor found somewhat to her surprise that she no longer hated him or wished him ill. Through the quietude of her own struggles, she had learned that clinging to resentment only buried her deeper in the cold. Perhaps he had found happiness, or perhaps he had regrets. Either way, she let the notion slip away without malice. Forgiveness, as she discovered, was as much a gift to herself as it was to anyone else. The glow of the winter festival lingered, radiating in small moments. A neighbor offering to shovel her walkway, the orphaned children calling her Grandma Eleanor from time to time, the sense of home in her own living room when she lit her lamp at dusk. Each day felt like another brushstroke on a canvas she'd once believed was left to decay in the attic of life. Her world was now vibrant, layered with new experiences, and painted in shades of hope and gratitude. One afternoon, while picking up supplies for another cookie baking session, Eleanor ran into the homeless man Jacob at the local grocery store. He had managed to find a part-time job stocking shelves, a humble start but a big step forward for someone who had been living on the streets. He smiled when he saw her, and she noticed the spark in his eyes, a sign that he too had discovered a renewed sense of dignity and purpose. He credited her in part for inspiring him to seek help. "You made me feel like I mattered," he told her, and that simple statement nearly brought tears to her eyes. Such encounters became more frequent. A young teacher from the community center confided in Eleanor that her gentle presence made a difference with the children. A single mother at the grocery store recognized her and said that her own mother had passed away recently, but seeing Eleanor around town somehow lessened the sting of that loss. To Eleanor, these affirmations were small miracles. They reminded her of the Pope's words, "You were once a light for someone else." She realized she still was and always could be. Yet amidst these bright days, she remained conscious of her advancing age. Her joints ached more often, and she occasionally felt dizzy after standing too long. Visits to the doctor became more frequent, though she tried not to let worry gnaw at her newfound serenity. She allowed neighbors to drive her to appointments, grateful for the support. Each day felt precious, a gift she intended to spend in ways that nurtured life, her own and others. In the old house, she finally took down some of the photos she had kept turned to the wall. She looked upon the images of her children when they were young, recalling birthday parties and school concerts. She put up new photos of the winter festival and of the children at the community center, wanting her home to reflect not just a distant past, but also the living present. Sometimes late at night, she flipped through albums and thought about all the phases of her life: the hopeful bride, the nurturing mother, the betrayed wife, the lonely widow, and now, in an unexpected twist, the community's gentle matriarch. It occurred to her that the changes made her who she was, and for once she felt at peace with every scar and every loss. No storm lasts forever, she told herself. She now understood that suffering could be a teacher. It taught empathy, patience, and the immeasurable power of simple kindness. With each act of care she gave, she felt a warmth flowing back into her. It wasn't a transaction, but rather a natural law of the heart. When you open it to give light, you also allow light to enter. Winter's second arrival since Eleanor's transformation was marked by another festival, this one even more lively and inclusive. The town, now more unified than it had been in years, expanded the celebration to multiple days, featuring a variety of events that encouraged people of all ages to participate. The children from the community center put on a small theatrical performance, a spirited adaptation of a classic fairy tale that ended with a lesson on kindness and empathy. Eleanor, of course, was invited to watch from the front row, and the kids beamed at her every time they took a bow. This time she noticed that nearly every corner of the festival had some small tribute to communal care. Free hot chocolate stations run by volunteers, coat drives for those who needed warm clothing, and a special stand where people could write down messages of gratitude on slips of paper and hang them on a wooden tree sculpture. The sense of shared goodwill was palpable, a testament to how a single spark could ignite an entire neighborhood. When the moment came for the official dedication, a group of townspeople gathered around Eleanor. They unveiled a new sign at the festival's central plaza, just beside the largest Christmas tree, that read Mother Eleanor's Corner, where cold hearts find warmth. This was a permanent marker made of carved wood meant to remain throughout the winter season. Seeing it brought tears to her eyes. She hadn't expected such an honor, nor did she feel she deserved it. She was simply doing what felt right, yet somehow that simple choice had blossomed into a communal movement. As she stood there, her hands trembling from both the chill in the air and the emotion welling up inside, she felt something akin to closure and renewal all at once. She had come full circle from a woman sitting alone in an icy house, ready to give up to a woman celebrated as the gentle heart of a town. The applause and cheers around her were almost overwhelming, so she simply placed a hand on her chest, her silent way of expressing gratitude for everyone present. After the dedication, the crowd dispersed to enjoy the rest of the festivities. Eleanor stayed near the new sign for a few minutes, letting the reality of it sink in. She thought back to how her journey began: a lonely night, a desperate mind, and a sermon that felt like a message from a divine source. She smiled through her tears, whispering a prayer of thanks into the frosty evening air. Life, as she realized, was full of second chances, if only one mustered the courage to see them. Thank you for continuing this journey with Eleanor. If her story has touched you in any way, consider leaving a comment or sharing it with someone who might need a little warmth today. Your support helps keep these tales alive. That night, after the festival's events drew to a close, Eleanor returned home. Instead of slipping into an empty, silent house, she was greeted by a sense of peace, a gentle knowledge that she was no longer isolated from the world. She brewed a cup of chamomile tea and settled into her armchair by the window, the very spot where her story had begun. But this time, the darkness outside did not intimidate her. She turned on a small lamp, its glow creating a cozy circle of light in the dim living room. Sipping her tea, she reflected on the miraculous chain of events that had led her here. The Pope's sermon that sparked the first hint of hope, the decision to bake cookies, the simple sign that said, "If you're cold, please take a cookie," and all the people she met as a result of those small acts. She realized that the greatest miracle was not an otherworldly intervention, but the gentle awakening of her own heart. That night, she was reminded of a line she'd read in a book once, something about miracles beginning with simple words. Now she understood that concept on a profound level. Her thoughts turned to her children, each of whom was planning a trip home within the next few months. She imagined the day they would stand in her living room, possibly shocked by how their mother had changed. Perhaps they would even join her in giving out cookies or sit with the children at the community center and read them stories. She smiled at the thought of reintroducing them to the warmth of a town they left long ago. She believed that even if their visits were brief, they would sense the shift in her perspective, the intangible but powerful aura of love she now carried. Though her body was tired, her mind was abuzz with memories and future possibilities. She found a pen and paper, deciding to write letters to each child. Even if they were to arrive soon, she wanted them to have something tangible, a piece of her spirit they could keep with them. She wrote about the Pope's sermon about Jacob and Lila, about the children at the community center, and about how their mother had found a spark in the darkness. The letters brimmed with hope, forgiveness, and the quiet conviction that life could turn around at any moment, so long as one kept their heart open. Finally, she set the letters aside, turned off her lamp, and let exhaustion cradle her into slumber. The hush of the house was no longer oppressive. It was restful like the quiet that follows a day well spent. As she drifted off, she felt a calm certainty that her story was far from over. There might be other challenges ahead, age, health, and the unpredictable arcs of life, but she knew she had the strength to face them. She had rediscovered her ability to love, and in doing so had found her place in the world once again. As the days turned into weeks and winter slowly retreated to make way for the first hints of spring, Eleanor's lamp continued to glow each evening by the window. Passers-by, who looked toward her house, would see that single steadfast light cutting through the twilight, a sign that she was still there, ready with a smile, a cup of tea or a cookie for anyone who needed it. She had become a fixture in the town's collective consciousness, a reassuring presence that suggested even the harshest of winters could soften around the edges if one heart chose to shine. Eventually, the day came when her children arrived one by one. Each reunion was bittersweet, filled with tears, apologies, and promises to do better. They marveled at the transformation in their mother, no longer withdrawn and frail but lively and engaged. She insisted they accompany her to the community center, where she proudly introduced them to the children she read stories to and to the friends she had made among the seniors. The siblings, moved by what they witnessed, pitched in to help for a day. Her older daughter even joked that seeing their mother called Mother Eleanor by the entire town felt surreal, but they quickly understood why the nickname stuck. They stayed through a weekend of mild spring weather, during which laughter and conversation echoed in the old house once again. Though they had to depart to return to their own lives, each child left with a renewed sense of connection, and the letters Eleanor had carefully written for them, which they promised to read on their journeys home. In the end, they thanked her too for showing them that love could persevere against even the darkest odds. The following winter, though it was many months away, would bring another blanket of snow, another silent hush across the town. But Eleanor was no longer afraid of that hush. She now understood that within that stillness, the seeds of hope could take root, waiting for the faintest light to help them grow. And so, on her final evening before the children returned to their distant cities, she sat by the window with them each holding a cup of tea. They watched the sky turn a tapestry of pink and orange and purple, the setting sun making a final dramatic statement. In that peaceful moment, life felt full, complete, and yet still brimming with possibility. In her quiet home, with the warmth of memories made and love rekindled, Eleanor rested her head against the back of her chair. She closed her eyes, the gentle murmur of her children's voices in the background. She felt no regrets. Perhaps this was her second chance, or maybe it was just the natural next chapter of a life that had been waiting to be written. A gentle smile curved on her lips as she remembered a closing phrase that now seemed more like a prophecy fulfilled. Sometimes miracles begin with just a few simple words. Sometimes lives reignite because a small light refused to die out. And with that, Eleanor's lamp kept glowing, a quiet beacon in the snowy night, signifying that hope once found could guide a heart forever. Thank you so much for joining me here at her Fireside Stories and sharing in Eleanor's beautiful journey of renewal and hope. Her story reminds us all of the incredible impact one small act of kindness can have, not just on others, but on ourselves as well. If Eleanor's journey touched your heart or inspired you, please hit that like button, leave a comment with your thoughts, and let me know from which corner of the world you listened today. And remember your subscription and support. Help keep these heartfelt stories coming to life. By subscribing, you'll ensure you never miss the next inspiring tale to warm your heart and brighten your day. Until next time, may your own fireside glow brightly, and may you always carry with you Eleanor's beautiful lesson that sometimes miracles begin with just a few simple words and lives reignite because a small light refused to die out. Take care and see you soon.